There's a saying in wrestling that for some performers it's going to take a long time to get over with fans, and once they are over, they'll be that way forever. And this could certainly apply to those we're going to be talking about today, as while they may have been late bloomers, they've certainly made the most of their time in the spotlight since. But who are the best examples of wrestlers that took a long time to catch on with fans? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Cody Rhodes. Yes, while he may be arguably the biggest star in all of wrestling today, this was not always the case for the American Nightmare, as back during the early days of his career, he was firmly slotted into a mid-card role. Yes, between 2007 and 2016, he never even got a sniff of the main event scene, and this was especially frustrating for him because aside from having all the natural talents required to be a top guy, he was also the son of the legendary Dusty Rhodes. So perhaps it shouldn't be surprising in hindsight then that upon realizing he'd hit the glass ceiling in WWE, Cody chose to bet on himself by leaving the company behind and going on a spirit quest throughout the Indies, a spirit quest which eventually saw him venture over to Japan and join the Bullet Club. And it was there he would form a relationship with the Elite, a relationship which would eventually lead to the creation of All Elite Wrestling in 2019. And this was where Cody finally got over as a main eventer for the first time, as during the early days of AEW, he was easily the brand's top babyface. And he was able to use all the star power he'd built to walk right back into WWE and become undisputed WWE champion just 2 years later by beating Roman Reigns at WrestleMania 40. That's right, by leaving the WWE behind and making a name for himself, the grandson of a plumber was able to go from undesirable to undeniable. And in doing so, he managed to fully get himself over with fans in a way he'd never been able to do before. And so it just goes to show that sometimes betting on yourself is the best option. It's certainly an option which has worked for others too, including our next subject, Drew McIntyre. Now we know WWE had big plans for Drew McIntyre back when he first debuted in WWE during the late 2000s. Hell, Vince McMahon actually came out to the ring at one point and proclaimed the Scotsman to be his new chosen one. But as we also know, this didn't exactly lead to him getting over in a major way, as just a few years after this he'd be stuck in the role of comedy jobber as part of 3MB. Why didn't Drew's first run click the way everyone in the company had hoped it might? It's hard to say. Maybe he was just too inexperienced at the time, or maybe fans just weren't ready for him yet. Whatever the reason, come 2014 it was clear things weren't working, and so that was why he was released from his contract at this point. But while this could have been the end of the Air Native's time in the spotlight, he chose to do what Cody Rhodes would later do here by building himself back up on the indie scene. So much so that after a successful run in TNA, he'd return to WWE in 2017, now an all-new man. And this new man truly felt like the star he hadn't been before. So it shouldn't be surprising to learn that after a few false starts, Vince McMahon chose to go all in with him here. How would he do this? Well, by having Drew win the 2020 Royal Rumble and then defeat Brock Lesnar for the WWE title at WrestleMania 36. Sure, this crowning moment was hampered somewhat by the fact that no fans were there, but McIntyre was able to take his real-life frustrations over this and eventually channel them into an awesome heel character, which is one of the best things happening in wrestling today. And because of this, it means the Scotsman has gotten more over than ever. Yes, whenever he's in front of a live crowd these days, he gets a massive reaction. One thing we can be sure of, though, is that as he continues to rise up the ranks of WWE, he's not going to be alone in doing so, as on the same brand as him, another unlikely single superstar has been born recently. Who are we talking about here? Why, our next subject, Jey Uso, of course. Yes, we know Jey Uso has been over for a long time as part of the Usos, but what we're talking about here today isn't his tag team run, rather his singles one, as no one could have foreseen that he'd excel so much in this role. Seriously, while Jey has always been great, it was generally accepted for a long time that he was great in the context of a pairing with his twin brother Jimmy, and that if you ever separated the two, then they would struggle to go it alone without the support of the other. But against all odds, when Jimmy fell to injury in 2020 and Jey was forced to fly solo for a while, he showed he had it in him all along to do so. And the way he did so was by putting on an excellent program with his cousin Roman Reigns in the autumn of that year. Now, obviously, it's a lot easier to get over when you're working with the top guy in the company, so there were understandable worries that Jay would struggle to reach those heights again after the feud with his cousin ended. But proving everyone wrong again, main event Jey Uso continued to excel in his new role, as over the next couple of years, he'd become a bona fide singles star. Yes, at this point, he's so far outshone his brother, it would almost feel like a step back for him if he were to return to tag team action. No, what he really needs instead is some singles gold, possibly the Intercontinental title at some point. That said, if he ever does win the IC strap, we no doubt he'll have many challengers lining up to take the belt off of him, one of whom might even be our next subject, LA Knight. Yeah! That's right, as one of wrestling's great late bloomers, there's no way we couldn't include LA Knight in today's video about people who got over after years of trying. After all, it took him until he was almost 40 to reach such a height. But ever since reaching that height, he's certainly taken the ball and run with it, as in recent years, the Maryland native has become one of WWE's breakout stars. How did he get to this point? Well, through a lot of hard work. As while Shawn Ricker was always great, during the earlier parts of his career, it was a struggle for him to get people to notice this. But then, to be fair to him, it was a lot harder to get noticed in the smaller leagues he was operating in, promotions like Impact and the NWA. So thank God once he joined WWE in 2021 then, Triple H saw the value in him and began pushing him on the NXT brand. Sure, there would be a few other roadblocks put in Knight's way once he was called up to the main roster a year or so later, but once Paul Levesque got a hold of the book there too, things would start to get back on track, and the former Impact World Champion would finally be able to begin his true rise to superstardom. And what a rise that's been, as at an age when most people are slowing down and beginning to think about retirement, LA Knight has seen his popularity skyrocket, and his position on the show reflect this as a result. And with him recently defeating Logan Paul for the United States Championship at SummerSlam, the sky's now the limit for him. But let's move away from the present for a moment, and instead to a time a little bit further back in the past, as it's there we find our next subject for today, a man who also didn't get over as a main eventer until a little later in life, Bret Hart. Yes, given the fact he's arguably the greatest wrestler to ever lace up a pair of boots, it might seem strange to think now that it took the Hitman until his mid-30s before he really broke out from the pack. But then considering the time prior to this was the golden era, maybe this shouldn't be so surprising. After all, compared to the other giants of the time, Hart was a relatively small guy. And in 80s WWF, being a small guy meant your best hopes of success were going to be in the tag team division. Once the time of Hulkamania came to an end though, and the steroid trial forced Vince McMahon to rethink what his stars should look like, the excellence of execution was suddenly provided an opportunity that would never have been possible before. And the reason he was chosen over everyone else here was because, aside from the fact there was no one better than him bell to bell, he'd proven to be a massive hit with fans. So as a result of this then, in the early 90s, Bret suddenly saw himself in the spot of face of the company, and with him now having the spotlight on him fully, he was able to show everyone exactly why he deserved the role with a series of matches such as his submission bout against Steve Austin at WrestleMania 13, or his pair of showdowns with his brother Owen in 1994, just to name a few. No, he never drew money for the promotion as well as those who came before or after him, but what Bret was able to introduce to WWF was the idea that the top star in the company could also be a guy who was the best in-ring performer. Of course, as the years went on, Vince McMahon would feel a lot more confident in pushing guys who were similar to Bret all the way to the top, even if it took him a while to pull the trigger sometimes. And this can be seen in our next subject, Kofi Kingston. That's right, how could we not talk about Kofi Kingston when we talk about wrestlers who had a late career breakout, as in many ways, he's the modern poster boy for such a phenomenon. After all, his rise was something fans thought they'd never see. Not because he wasn't talented enough for it, but because by 2019, a decade of being a mid-carder seemed to have firmly slotted him in his spot in the WWE hierarchy. But of course, occasionally magic moments do happen, and Kofi Mania was most certainly one of those magic moments. For those who weren't watching at the turn of the decade, basically what happened here was that in the lead up to that February's Elimination Chamber, Mustafa Ali got injured and had to be replaced at the last minute by the Ghanaian-born star. Not that this was supposed to be the start of anything big for Kofi though. No, he was still just another wrestler in the match. But such a star-making performance did he put on here, it forced WWE to change their WrestleMania plans and have him there challenge Daniel Bryan for the WWE title. And we all know what happened next. In one of the greatest feel-good moments of the modern era, Kingston won the world title. No, the title reign which came after didn't amount to much, but for a while at least, Kofi truly was a main event guy in WWE, something even his biggest fans had maybe given up hope of ever seeing happen. And during that time he was on top, he was able to prove that he'd always belonged there, as he kept delivering whenever asked to defend his gold. But what of the other notable member of the New Day who finally rose to the top of the card relatively late into his career? Surely he deserves a mention in this video too, right? Yes, and that's why our next subject is none other than Big E. Yes, it felt so satisfying to finally see him reach the top of the mountain in 2021. Sure, it wasn't like he was given no focus before this. That said, his focus had always been as part of a stable where he was never really pushed beyond the mid-card, with this being evident in his time with both Dolph Ziggler and AJ Lee, and Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods. Deep down, however, fans knew he had it in him to be more than this, and while it might have taken a while for this to happen, it eventually did. Yes, after years of toiling in the mid-card, doing what was asked of him and always delivering results, Big E finally saw his moment in the spotlight coming when in July of 2021, he won the men's Money in the Bank contract. Needless to say then, after that, it was just a case of him choosing the right moment to strike, with this moment coming on the September 13th episode of Raw that year. This was when he would cash in his contract on someone we'll get to in a moment to win the WWE title for the first time in his career. Yes, it was quite a scene, and one which told us all that after years of grinding away and always hitting that glass ceiling, the Florida native had finally managed to break through and reach the main event level as a solo act. Sadly though, much like with his teammate Kofi, his run with the belt wasn't the greatest. That said, none of this should lead you to believe that Big E's time in the main event was a failure overall, as he certainly proved he belonged while he was there. And if he ever gets cleared to return to the ring again following his neck injury in 2022, we reckon there's every chance he could rise to the mountaintop again. But what of that man we alluded to a moment ago, who he beat to become champion? He certainly deserves a spot in today's video too, because he was another man who didn't get over until later on in his career. The one, the only, Bobby Lashley. Sure, we know WWE went all in with Lashley back during his first run with the company in the mid-2000s, but despite everyone's best efforts, he never really managed to break out to the level of true superstardom then. No, like with Cody Rhodes and Drew McIntyre, it wouldn't be until he left the WWE behind for a few years and rebuilt himself in TNA that he'd be able to return as a far bigger star. Obviously though, by that point, he was a little bit longer in the tooth, and so his rise to the top can be considered that of a late bloomer. Still, this is no slight on him, as to look at the Kansas native, you would never think he was a man currently in his late 40s. Rather, you'd think of him as someone still very much in his prime. And it's for this reason that WWE went all in on him during his second run, as this was the point he finally became WWE champion. Yes, he did have to overcome a couple of false starts before he got there. False starts in the form of that feud with Sami Zayn, which centered around his sisters, or the segments in which Lio Rush acted as his hype man. But once he'd powered through these and it was time to start treating him like a real main event threat again, Bobby was more than ready to get to work, with this being what eventually led to him dethroning The Miz to take home the top prize in the company in early 2021. And this one went over well with fans too, as we all seemed happy to see Lashley finally get his moment in the sun. Unfortunately though, it didn't last long enough. And that's because once he lost the belt, the big man found himself slipping down the card all the way to the point that he's part ways with the company in 2024. Where does he go from here? Well, that remains to be seen, though the only two realistic options for him in wrestling at this point seem to be AEW and TNA. And if he does go to the latter, he might even find himself sharing a locker room with our next subject, PCO. Of course, what makes PCO's rise to stardom at a late stage in his career stand out all the more is that, unlike everyone else we've looked at today, he didn't do this in WWE. Rather, he did it completely free from that system. So how did he do this? Well, after having runs in 90s WWF as both a tag team and solo act, Pierre Carlo Ulette ventured out into the world of the indies in the 2000s. And while it seemed like this was going to be where his career started winding down eventually, something completely unexpected happened in 2018, as that was when, now at 49 years old, he finally had his breakout moment when he created his French Frankenstein character. Yes, it was a late career surprise to say the least, but it got over huge with audiences who were watching the likes of Ring of Honor and Impact at the time. So over would it get, in fact, that during his run, PCO would become a one-time ROH World Champion and one-time TNA Digital Media Champion. Could anyone have foreseen this back when they were watching the Quebecers during New Generation era WWE TV? That seems highly unlikely. But here we are, and as things stand today, the Quebec native is a bigger star than he's ever been. Not that this means he'll never get an offer from WWE again before all is said and done though, an offer which allows him one more opportunity to bask in the spotlight of a true big league. But let's step back in time again, all the way back to the mid-2000s when our next subject, JBL, finally got over as a big star. That's right, it might have taken him a while to get there, but eventually John Bradshaw Layfield did reach the mountaintop as a solo act. And once he got there, he was a made man for the rest of his days, as no longer would he have to worry about falling back down into the mid-card. That said, prior to this happening, he certainly did have some things to be fearful of, as after splitting with Farouk and trying out his hand as a single star in the early 2000s, there were certainly more than a few roadblocks standing in his path. Some of these roadblocks were self-imposed, what with him not really connecting with fans in a major way, and some of them were out of his control, such as him not truly being booked like a main event player. But whatever the reason on any given week, the end result was the same, and that was JBL just wasn't hitting as a top-level guy in WWE. Of course, all of this changed in 2004 though, as that was when, following a pretty dramatic character shift which saw him go from hard-drinking bar brawler to J.R. Ewing-style businessman pretty much overnight, the Texan suddenly found himself a world title contender. Hell, he wouldn't just be a contender, no, he'd actually become champion when he beat Eddie Guerrero for the honor at May 16, 2004's Judgment Day. And after that happened, it would be off to the races as JBL held on to the top prize for the next 280 days, a SmackDown record at the time, with this being what fully solidified him as a main eventer for the rest of his in-ring career. Really, the only negative you could say about the whole thing is that it came pretty late in Layfield's career, what with almost being 40 by that point, so he never got a long time to enjoy being on top of the card when compared to some of his peers. But whether it was ultimately short-lived or not, he certainly made the most out of the time he had, and would use every appearance on the Blue brand from there on in to remind people why WWE were right to push him to that level. And JBL wasn't the only older performer who finally got that big WWE break during the Ruthless Aggression era either, as the exact same thing could be said about our next subject too, Finley. Now we're not going to say Finley only got recognized for being good during the mid-2000s SmackDown. No, because as far back as the 90s, when he was working for WCW, the Belfast native was recognized as being one of the better in-ring workers out there. But in terms of finding next-level success, well, that didn't happen until his run in WWE during his time on SmackDown. How did he reach such a point? Well, after spending his first few years under WWE's employ working as a trainer, the company seemed to realize he was still a great wrestler, and that was exactly why they started booking him to appear on Thursday nights, where he'd do things like hold the United States title and serve a role in King Booker's court. He'd even continue on in this role all the way up until 2011, at which point he parted ways with the company and spent most of his time helping to prepare his son David to one day become the leader of the Bullet Club. Was it sad he never got a chance to win the big one in the WWE? Sure, but for Finley, a man who, come the mid-2000s, was well into his 40s, this was always going to be unlikely. However, the fact that he got to have a great run in WWE is something he'll be able to hang his hat on forevermore. But then everyone we've looked at today should be able to hang their hat on the fact that they achieved so much so late into their careers, as not everyone still has that much juice left in them during their twilight runs. We guess it just shows that never slowing down, no matter what age you are, really is what separates the good from the great.